welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us, we have a special guest, Dr. Warren Coates. He recently authored his book about his travels to Kosovo, but besides his writings, he has an expertise in monetary and financial policy and experience in democracy and state building in various parts of the world, the Balkans, as well as Afghanistan and Iraq. And today we'll be discussing both the writing and these experiences and how the history of these efforts levels up with the current situation, the current financial and political environment in these areas. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Coates. Could you give us a little bit more of a background in your interest in these areas and how you ended up where you did?
Well, let's see how far I can get in a minute or two of summarizing my life. I was born and raised in Bakersfield, California. My senior year in high school, I lived in Germany as an exchange student, walking distance from the border with East Germany. And that had a important impact on my experience in my life and my thinking. When I returned home, I went to Bakersfield College for 2 years, graduated in economics from the University of California at Berkeley, then got a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman. And if you want to know where my interest in money came from, that's where it came from. I then taught at the University of Virginia for 5 years before going to the International Monetary Fund, where I spent the bulk of my career. And the last 10, 15 years of it, I was leading technical assistance missions, as we call them, of a group of experts in various aspects of central banking to initially Bulgaria, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, the former Soviet Union, basically, that were very interested in learning how to modify their operations to be more consistent with market economies. So that was fascinating and quite exciting. But with that background, I guess I was then increasingly called upon to lead missions to post-conflict countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, Kosovo, Bosnia, if I didn't mention that already. So that's the broad sweep of what I've been doing. And in every instance, it was focused on how to either improve upon the capacity of those central banks we were visiting to manage their currencies, or in some instances, actually to introduce currencies that they didn't have before. And in, for example, the case of Kosovo, the most recent one I have written about, basically picking up and reestablishing a monetary and payment system out of the ashes. People, if you ask, do you know what money is? I don't think anyone would say, no, I don't know what money is. But they sometimes confuse it with income. But to get into the back room, to get into the plumbing and the details of what are required to manage money is what my missions were about, and is what I hope we can talk about some here, because it's has many aspects that are not obvious to people, and it could be quite interesting. At least it's always been very interesting to me. So let me pause there.
Well, I'll start with a very broad question, which I think many people might find a little bit mystifying, especially in light of some current debates brought up by the presidential election in the US and other more general broader factor, which is the determining the value of money, value of currency, especially when they are trying to develop a currency in a newly established state with no pre-existing record or history of independent financial transactions and no credit history, credit rating, or anything to really back that value. How do you do that? How do you go about doing that?
From the beginning of time, basically, from the beginning of money, the assets that took on the role of money and became money invariably acquired their value because, well, ultimately, their value is derived from what you can buy with them, what you can exchange it for. But in anchoring that value, invariably, there was some explicit or implicit commitment on the part of those issuing that asset to redeem it for something else of value. I think the gold standard is very well known, at least vaguely, by most people, and that was a system in which the value of money was fixed to gold. A dollar at one point was $35 per ounce, and that meant that if you no longer trusted or wanted a dollar, you could exchange it at that price for gold. So whatever the monetary system, invariably it comes down at some point or another to the trust of the public that this currency has a value that's linked to something else that they could exchange it for if they want. In modern monetary systems, fiat systems that are not, the term really means a system based on faith, the currency is not fixed in price to anything else. You know, we no longer have a gold standard. Gold standard was the historically most important monetary regime. But what anchors really in the thinking of modern economists the value of money is the fact that the government that is issuing it promises that it can be used at whatever price is prevailing to pay taxes. So you always have a use for money by discharging your tax obligations to the government. So that's the kind of anchor. But in a way that disguises, I think, how modern monetary policy works. And we can go into as much detail on this as you want, or the various aspects, but current modern monetary systems come down to, this is my Friedman Chicago way of thinking of things, supply and demand. If you increase the supply of money more rapidly than the public demands it to hold, because you can't pay things. Actually, let me take a quick step back, just to define quickly what money really is, and its key uses. Money is a unit of account. So one of the huge benefits and services that it performs is that it standardizes the way in which the value of all the things that we see in the store or on Amazon or wherever we do our shopping, they're all priced in money. In the United States, they're all priced in dollars. So that is the unit of account function of money, and it's a benefit so obvious that we don't even think of it anymore. But it's an overwhelming benefit that everything you think about paying for or buying can be easily compared because they're all priced in the same unit. They're all priced in dollars. So that is a critical feature and function of what money does. And as economies grow, as the amount of goods available to be purchased, people's incomes grow, they will need to hold an inventory of more money in order to make the monthly rent payment, to pay the credit card bill every month, to pay the grocer, to make all the payments with this asset, this money, that are needed from day-to-day life. You have to have an inventory of it. You have to have some stock of money. Well, that's how economists think of the demand for money, basically. As the economy grows, the demand for money grows, et cetera. So supply demand, if the supply of money grows more rapidly than the demand I just described, you have inflation. If supply exceeds what's demanded, then prices go up to raise the nominal demand for money to match the supply. So there are many other elements, especially on the fiscal side, fiscal deficits, the tax regimes, many other things that influence the value of money. But ultimately, though only slightly simplified, thinking of it in terms of supply and demand is very, very powerful and a very useful way of thinking of what determines the value of money when it's no longer fixed to gold or fixed in price to anything else. Some currencies are fixed to other currencies. Many other countries fix the value of their currency to the dollar or to the euro. But when you don't fix to anything, then monetary policy and managing the value of money comes down to the central bank carefully managing its supply relative to its demand.
So you've had the chance to travel a wide variety of different countries, some completely new, others with some sort of a pre-existing history, ranging from Iraq, from Afghanistan to Kyrgyzstan, Bosnia, and so forth. What was the experience of trying to deal with these currency-related issues? Like, what were the different approaches, and what was the most surprising thing for you?
Well, let me take a step back from this broader discussion I just had of supply and demand for money as the way of regulating its value. There are other elements to the management of a currency that hit us in the face when we go to places like Kosovo, for example, that the average citizen doesn't really think about. These are, mechanical in some way. If you start by thinking of currency, banknotes, pieces of paper that you can pay things with, to regulate the supply, you have to be sure that there aren't others, counterfeiters, who are printing their own version and trying to pass it off as your currency. So the design of banknotes and the security features that help the public and banks and the central bank verify that these are legitimate, honestly issued notes, not counterfeit, is an important issue. In Bosnia, Herzegovina, we spent almost a year discussing, I put discussing in quotes, they weren't always pleasant or congenial, but we discussed for almost a year whose pictures and what words and other features should go on to the new banknotes that were going to be introduced. And you can read all this in my book on Bosnia-Herzegovina. I won't go into the details, but it's where the three ethnically diverse, the Croat, Serb, and Bosniak portions of the population were all struggling to assert their identities, their heroes, and their way of looking at things. The banknote, how it was designed and what it said on it and whose picture was on it was a big issue. This is an interesting point. Let me slip it in. Of the monetary regimes, the ways in which the supply of money can be regulated, that I think is the most sensible and powerful for small, medium-sized countries, if not larger countries, is what we call a currency board. A currency board is where the central bank has no independent policy of its own about how much currency it prints and introduces. It sets a price that is absolutely fixed and unchangeable and leaves it to the public to demand whatever they want at that price. So the supply of money is market determined by the demand of the public at the fixed price given by the central bank. So the central bank has no monetary policy in the sense of doing anything to cause the supply of money to be anything different than what the public is willing to pay for and to buy. Many countries don't like that system because they like the central bank to have more discretion to manipulate, maybe for business cycle reasons, recession, and so on. But there are a number of countries that follow currency board rules, such as Bulgaria, for example. Well, I pushed this idea in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but it was totally unnecessary because there was nothing else they would even contemplate. They didn't trust one another, the three groups, enough to give any kind of discretion to the central bank. So they all immediately embraced. Of course, we'll have a currency board rules. No discussion. What was discussed for a year was whose picture to put on the currency. Something that is we were never involved in before. It never seemed very important to us, but that was the all important thing to them. Okay, well, let me get on with the story of banknotes. In addition to the design of them, security features, and so on, they wear out in time. And there have to be mechanisms for identifying old and damaged notes and replacing them with new ones. These are among the things that we need. My teams had to help Kosovo and some of the other post-conflict countries set up systems to manage. Just think, we are well along into digital payments. Very few, I don't know what it is in the United States, but it's surely 80 to 90% of all payments are digital. By digital, I mean, issuing orders, whether on a paper check or through an email message to your central bank to transfer money from your bank account to somebody else's bank account. That's how almost all payments are made. A lot of them are made on credit cards as well, and then you pay the credit card company for having paid executed all your payments at the end of every month. Very few anymore are paper currency. And that's the direction things are going to continue going. We don't always appreciate how cumbersome and costly it is dealing with paper. It's not just a matter of printing new notes and replacing old notes. Every shop that has a cash register and deals in cash, and there are a few now who refuse to deal in cash, they will only accept credit cards, but that requires a very careful mechanism to ensure that the people who have access to that cash register are held accountable and can't stick some of it in their pockets. You know, I mean, we don't think much about those aspects, but that is a potentially cumbersome aspect of making payments with banknotes, with currency. So I think that will help drive currency out of existence, and everything will be done digitally in the future, although most of it is already digital now. But these were things we had to give a lot of attention to in Kosovo, for example, or any of these other countries as well, but particularly Kosovo, because it was basically totally collapsed and they had given up the official currency supplied by Yugoslavia and Serbia to Kosovo, which initially, or for a period, was a part of Serbia. Most people in Kosovo were actually transacting in German marks, later succeeded by the euro. So how will the monetary authority of Kosovo acquire and manage and maintain the integrity of euros, if that's the currency they're using? So these are questions that greatly favor digital payments, bank transfers, and the Zoom and other PayPal and other modern ways by which we make payments. Okay, so I forgot where I was going with all this, but to just highlight some of the things most people don't think about when it comes to how you actually, not only the monetary policy that determines the overall supply of currency, but what are the mechanisms and systems by which payments with that currency actually get made, money actually transferred from me to you. And obviously, digital payments are vastly superior and easier, and cross borders with a blink of an eye, or across the country. You don't have to get in a plane and deliver the cash to your grandchildren. So anyway, these are the things that I found exciting, fascinating, and challenging in terms of helping Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries to either reestablish or modernize their systems of managing the currency, which is what's important for preserving its value, supply and demand, and having efficient payment mechanisms, efficient ways of delivering your currency to someone you need to pay. So that's what my last 30 years have been devoted to, and I found it very, very interesting.
Now, one early experience I remember from my life in post-Soviet space was well, first of all, huge inflation that struck almost immediately, and the use of so-called coupons to remunerate the workers instead of actual proper currency. And this eventually became completely lacking in any value whatsoever. And literally became play money. To what extent has this experience? Have you dealt with this experience in the countries you've traveled to, and what exactly causes such a collapse of a system?
Well, if the monetary authority, the central bank, who in every country is responsible for issuing currency and managing it, if in Afghanistan now, for example, the Taliban regime has serious problems in maintaining their banknote supply because they don't have the foreign exchange with which to pay. I think notes are printed in France or Germany, one or the other, but their banknotes are printed abroad. They can't pay the printer to print and ship because they don't have the US dollars. The French, the printer of Afghanis is not going to accept Afghanis in payment. The French printer or the German printer or whoever the printer is going to accept only US dollars or euros or some equally respectable, sound international currency. They don't accept the currency that they're printing themselves for the country. So Afghanistan is having serious trouble keeping their currency in good shape. It just keeps wearing out and they can't replace it with new ones. So that is a part. Let me give another example that's soldiers in World War II will remember this if they're any of them still alive. In Iraq, for example, in Kosovo and all these places, I've been talking about banknotes, but coins are much more expensive and to produce, although much more durable, but also much lower in value. So the value proposition of having adequate coins can be pretty challenging. And since Kosovo, for example, is using euros, a currency they don't manufacture themselves at all. Well, let me go back to Iraq. In Iraq, we had the same problem in the first year or two of US occupation of having an adequate supply of currency and especially coins, because and explicitly in Kosovo we made the decision. I mean, the authorities made the decision in consultation with us that it was just too expensive to import coins. So they just got along without having enough coins. So what do? In Iraq, in the PX, military PX, the store, where there were no coins, but they use coupons often for coins that could only be used there. I mean, if you bought something and should have gotten 75 cents back, they didn't have 75 cents of coins to give you. They'd give you a coupon that next time you came to the PX, you could exchange for the 75 cents equivalent of whatever you were buying then. But often, and in Kosovo, this was certainly the case, shopkeepers would often make change by giving a candy bar or some such thing, that was hopefully close to the equivalent value of what they would have given you in coins if they had coins, but they didn't have coins. So these are the kinds of challenges that these countries very often face that the average American never thought about.
So you travel from one place to another, and there's obviously very different attitudes towards implementation and creation of a sound system that and managing the economy or not managing, interfering or not interfering. How I mean, IMF had a particular perspective on all these things. So how were you able to deal with different financial cultures, different political mindsets, and different local attitudes?
Well, there was no country I ever went to where people did not want, if not expect, the currency that they daily dealt with to have a stable value. So there was no cultural difference that, even in Turkey, which has had decades of high inflation, of 50, 60, 70, 80% inflation every year for many, many years, they learn to live with it, but nobody likes it. So there's no cultural difference I ever encountered with regard to an attitude about the desirability of stable money. And let me just repeat, from what I was discussing before, the profound difference between the mechanisms that are needed or desirable to manage the value of the currency, really to manage the supply of the currency. That's one aspect. The other are all these elements of how to deliver it, how to keep the notes clean, how to set up transfer systems between my bank and your bank. So the difference between preserving the value of the money and the payment mechanisms by which it's exchanged from one person to another are really quite different processes, but they all involve money.
No.
So we don't see big cultural differences in people's attitudes toward money.
So interestingly enough, on the one hand, this creation and management of currency is a basic function of the state. On the other hand, over the years, we have heard a lot of complaints about IMF, about loans, about the conditions for those loans, about expectations from different countries. What is the reality? Are some of these criticisms justified, and in what sense? Or on the other hand, are we talking about entirely corrupt systems that basically shun accountability?
Well, that's a pretty big question. Many countries suffer from corruption at the government level. Government officials getting wealthy by siphoning off some of the resources of the government and so on. And that harms the development of the economy. It harms the standard of living. It harms public trust in institutions. It's bad in every way, but it's quite pervasive across many countries. When we're now shifting from money to income, government income, taxes, and government spending, many governments wind up, and the United States is seriously guilty of this in recent years, spending more money than they have, spending money that they have to borrow, i.e., going into debt. For governments to borrow for some things is sensible, within reason, within limits. If you're borrowing to build a dam or a highway or some such thing that's going to have a very long life, it may make sense to borrow the capital expenditure of creating it in the first place and then paying that down over its 20, 30-year life or whatever. So debt is not always a bad thing, but it has to be for reasonable purposes, and it has to be temporary. And this is where the IMF often comes into the picture, where a country is no longer able to easily honor its debt obligations to the rest of the world, or even to its own citizens. But often countries borrow abroad. They borrow dollars, and Argentina is sort of perpetually in this situation. Why anybody lends to them is slightly a mystery, but there are times when the help of the IMF in helping a country transition back to fiscal viability. By fiscal viability, I mean keeping their expenditures in line with what they can afford, with the tax revenues that they raise. So the IMF invariably, when countries get into that kind of trouble, that they're either going to have to default and be cut off from world finance altogether, or get help in paying them their way out over time as a part of correcting the fiscal excesses that got them into trouble in the first place. This is what the IMF does. If the country would benefit from temporary external financing from the IMF, invariably it's in exchange for the country taking the measures that it needs to bring its finances under control, to bring its spending into line with the resources that it can raise through taxes. So an IMF loan virtually always has these kinds of conditions that countries, usually it's countries are overspending, and the IMF is monitoring that they reduce fiscal spending, that they direct it to more productive things, less corruptive oriented things. So that's what the IMF's role is normally. It's focused on fiscal policy and the country's exchange rate to other currencies, which is an integral part of monetary policy as well.
Now, different countries have their own different periods of transition, especially when transitioning into a new system, and different factors can complicate those things, obviously.
Right.
What are some of the craziest complications have you seen that go beyond the normal sort of challenges one might expect from new or small and struggling states?
I think that the most important insight, the most important lesson that anyone needs to have in mind who is in a position to influence the reforms of a country. We can take two rather different situations. One, the collapse of the Soviet Union, where suddenly there were 15 new countries, all quite eager to understand and adopt the ways of market economies, because that just proved to be dramatically more effective and productive than central planning. So, they wanted to learn what kinds of laws, what kinds of rules and institutions and mechanisms that the government should adopt that would allow the flourishing of private markets. The transition starting in 1992 of the former Soviet republics to market economies was a huge, huge undertaking, a huge remaking of the laws and institutions by which people's daily lives lived, or were carried out. So, in some countries, this worked better than in others. What I always would like to stress, and in a way, it's even more important in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, rather than a voluntarily transitioning economy. It's a post-conflict economy. Is that those of us offering advice and trying to share what has worked well in the rest of the world and so on, must understand the traditions, culture, laws that we start with, that are in place, that people have lived by. The term that always drove me right up the wall was anyone who suggested, and I heard this in Iraq from time to time, oh, we have a clean slate. We can just write in all the right rules, and And that's nonsense. It's utter nonsense because, you always start with decades worth of culture, of way people have thought about things and acted, and the institutions that they have worked with and through and so on. If those need to be changed, and many times they did, you need to know what they are to begin with in order to understand the more promising, the least disruptive and most promising way of transitioning. So to me, that was one of the most important and difficult lessons that the international aid-giving and advice-giving community needed very much to take to heart, that to help improve the conditions of a country, which invariably means improving laws and institutions and so on, you need to appreciate what exists to begin with, what works okay or well in that, what doesn't, and before deciding how best to transition, where you want to go from there and what the best path is. One more example, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a huge debate over Big Bang or gradualism in terms of the transition. I still don't know what the right answer is, but the issue, okay, at the time, I was very much of the mind that gradualism was the only promising way of moving a culture from central planning to a market environment. But the Big Bang view had the merit of recognizing that, well, what if those in charge, who are sort of gradually giving up some of their powers and influence, decide they don't want to do that anymore? The Big Bang means you get all these state-owned enterprises into private hands right away, before any of the oligarchs can change their minds and decide they want to keep it. And that has a lot of merit, that view. But the problem is that when you suddenly put it in private hands, there's no private culture of dealing and managing in that kind of environment, and that can all fall apart. So these are not simple questions. That's what I'm trying to say here, is that, and I'm not sure 100% in every case what the best answer is, but in general, I think we have to be very, very aware of the starting point, very, very aware of what exists in the country before discussing what might be changed and how to change it.
Now, I wanted to kind of also circle back to Iraq, because like the Soviet Union, it was transitioning from a dictatorship-based system with a lot of similar types of state control over the economy, but it is also a very different culture in many ways, and quite frankly, corruption there was quite rampant as well, but probably manifested itself differently in different circumstances. There was a lot more informal transaction culture, and so forth. So what was possible to do under the circumstances? And there's also that element of tribalism, sectarianism in Iraq that is not, necessarily quite the same in the post-Soviet space.
Right, very much the case in Afghanistan also. Yeah. Keep in mind that my narrow focus was money and the financial system. So there are many other pieces that make up a successful society that not expert in and was not involved in doing anything about. But I must say, the environment of Iraq was different than any other country I worked in, not because Iraq was any different, but because it was an American show. It was the United States coming in as an imperial power and trying to do good things, trying to make this into a nice place. And we made a mess of it. These are the people who were saying, oh, we have a blank slate. So we can just, write this. Let me give you a couple of specific examples. In one of our first trips, before I'd retired from the fund, and then I retired and came back to Iraq as supervised by the U.S. Treasury as a consultant. And in the before I retired, in the earlier trip, the person the U.S. had put in charge of Treasury, finance, sort of things, when we visited on our first visit, since he knew the IMF had regularly plays an important role in helping draft banking legislation, central banking legislation, financial regulation in general, he said, I want you to give me a bank licensing law, right away, because it would be good to get American or international banks licensed in here because they bring a lot of expertise and knowledge with them. Well, that's absolutely correct. I mean, it would be good to have them there. But we had to convince him that no respectable bank, even with a perfect bank licensing law, whatever the hell that is, would come and seek a license if they didn't know what the rest of the banking law was, if they didn't know the entire legal environment in which they would function. So we said, no, we're not going to write you a bank licensing law. You have to have an entire banking law that describes all aspects of the business that a bank would do, which is going to take more than the couple of weeks you'd like us to do it in. And he acquiesced. But even then, it was a law that we were under enormous pressure to write quickly. We wrote it in Washington and in New York, and they put it in place. A year later, when I was living there as a consultant to the U.S. Treasury, I had a discussion with the vice governor of the central bank, about that law. He said, oh, that. He said, first of all, the translation is terrible and nobody pays it the slightest attention to it anyway. It's just, it's just on the shelf there somewhere. The way in which the IMF traditionally helps draft a banking law is sitting down with the local banking community, the local legal advisors in the central bank, understanding thoroughly what legal provisions and structure they have in place, what the weaknesses and strengths are. We bring with us our knowledge of what best practice is around the world. I mean, there are some provisions in laws that have changed a lot for good reason, almost everywhere. But we do it building up from what is there. And when we finish, the local legal authorities know every word in there and have agreed to every word that is in there and understand the purpose of those things. What happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq, was just a travesty. It was ridiculous. It was embarrassing. And most of what was going on in Baghdad was one U.S. agency fighting with the other one to be in a more dominant position or have its point of view persevere. Nothing to do with the Iraqis. So I was appalled by U.S. behavior in Iraq.
So how do you prevent, in the event where US or any other country is in a position of control or in a position to make impact, how do, first of all, provide the financial and legal infrastructure that makes any changes meaningful, and second, prevent this sort of bureaucratic interfacing that's unhelpful?
Well, let me think of Kosovo, which is my most recent book. It's really to repeat, what I was stressing earlier is that if we want to help them adopt better institutions, better laws, and so on, we have to understand clearly what they have to begin with, what they are culturally used to, why they're culturally used to it. Oftentimes it's just because the leader, previous leader wanted to keep tight control over something, and so maybe that should go away or should be seriously modified. But the IMF likes to use the term ownership. If a country that we're lending money to doesn't own the program, doesn't own the reforms that we have made a condition of the loan, if they don't own it, meaning if they have not bought into its being valuable to them and something they should do and want to do, it won't happen. So their ownership with the reform is essential.
So
now we can bring the knowledge and experience of the rest of the world, of what things have worked well and not worked well in other places. So we have a lot of useful information to share with them, but unless they own it, then it's not going to go anywhere.
So on the one hand, this desire to be the big brother, and on the other hand, this, lack of complete social understanding of the society we were dealing with has apparently served us a bad turn on probably more than one occasion, I would say. But I'm curious, getting back to your books, given your extensive travels, what were the main takeaways that you were trying to emphasize and bring attention to for anyone reading and watching these developments? What was it that you wanted to convey in terms of this of your experiences, your travel observations?
Bearing in mind that my expertise is money, my first and primary goal was always to help establish in a country a mechanism and policy for regulating money that would do the best job of preserving the stability of the value of money. So again, those policies that regulate the supply are, number one, of importance. Bringing more modern payment technology, digital payments and other ways of economizing on clearing payments between banks, and all of those things. There's a lot of experience around the world which evolves over time and it gets better. Those are more technical aspects, and they're very important. But my primary concern and focus was on the policies to preserve the stability of the value of money. And for that, I was often promoting currency board rules that I described a bit earlier, where the central bank would not make decisions about how much money to create. They would set the price of that currency, usually to another currency, usually to the US dollar or to the euro. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's a currency board, and its currency is fixed to the euro. So same with Bulgaria. so they leave it to the public to regulate the supply of money. The public, when the public wants more, they buy more, and that creates new currency. So that's been one of my passions, let's say, stable money, and currency boards can play an important role.
So this issue,
It's a version of the gold standard, really. The gold standard was not always rigorously adhered to, even where a currency fixed the price to gold and therefore got into trouble. But if one was meticulous and rigidly stuck to the rules of a gold standard, that would be a currency board rule, basically. Rather than fixing your currency to the euro or the dollar, you fixed it to gold, but you left it to the market to regulate how much there was at that price.
Now, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because in light of these decades of varying degrees of success or not, or the opposite, we have a lot of experience, a lot of history to draw on, even to deal with more contemporary developments in the monetary sector. And it's funny that you mentioned the gold standard again, because one of the presidential candidates, specifically Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I don't want to dwell on the rest of anything that he has to say, but the one point that touches on what you said was his advocacy to bring back the gold standard, or to tie the dollar to Bitcoin, which is the only cryptocurrency that is not considered a security by the SEC. What do you make of this proposal? I mean, personally, I don't think it's likely to happen, but in theory, if that were possible, do you think that is even desirable in the American context?
Well, I would not myself advocate that the US fix its currency to gold anyway. Even though I like the system, currency board system, in which the market demand determines the supply of money, given the price you've given it for something. I would not make that something gold anymore. But the idea to fix it to Bitcoin tells you all you need to know about Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yeah,
he's just not.
It doesn't make sense, because Bitcoin itself would need to be backed up by Treasury, which kind of makes it an entirely circular system, whatever you think of Bitcoin on its own terms.
Bitcoin is not backed by anything except the promise that its supply is above manipulation, that its supply is rigidly determined by a formula over time. That's one virtue. You cannot exchange it with a guaranteed price for anything whatsoever. It's backed by absolutely nothing, but it has a very well-defined supply. So that's something. But I'm not a Bitcoin fan, but I am a fan of some of the payment technology that has evolved for the dollar and other cryptocurrencies as well, that improve the efficiency of transferring whatever the asset is, whether it's dollars or something else. So I'm a big fan of the technical progress in payments that we have seen, but I would not advocate anchoring the price of Bitcoin.
By the way, speaking of blockchain technologies and digitalization of the payment processes, there's been a great deal of panic in certain circles, which I'm sure you have seen, concerning the centralized digital currency as developed, well, as in development allegedly by the US, as well as its increasing implementation in various other countries. Essentially, the arguments against it is that it will kill the value of the dollar. It will create a massive privacy violation on behalf of by the US government, and it's essentially going to prevent people from being able to exchange engage in transactions without government oversight. What do you make of these concerns?
Yeah, that maybe we can end on this this very interesting subject, and the CBDCs, central bank digital currencies that every central bank is looking at and talking about is indeed quite controversial, even among my friends and so on. I think some of the complaints raised are not serious. There's no reason that privacy cannot be preserved as well as it is with bank account transfers. Government can access that information under controlled, limited circumstances with a court order, and the same could be true with the central bank digital currency. So I don't see there's any privacy issue there different than the privacy issues we already face with the fact that almost all payments are made by bank transfers. There is something, though, that I want to flag as something that I think is very promising for central bank digital currency. Our banking system and its biggest weakness arises from what's called fractional reserve banking, which means that when you deposit money in your account, the bank doesn't keep it there for you. It's not in a safe there that you can come and take out when you want to. The bank lends it out to somebody else. And you have the right to withdraw that on call anytime you want, at any minute. You know, the bank might delay you a few hours or a day, but you have the right to take it out. It's at call, but the money, but it's not there. It's been lent for 10 years to somebody. So the bank has to manage, they have to keep enough in the vaults to satisfy the few withdrawals that come along. They have to have some treasury bills that they can sell quickly if they need more, et cetera. But that's where banks most often get into trouble. Bank failures, runs on banks arise from this phenomenon of fractional reserve banking. CBDCs have the characteristics of what is often called the Chicago Plan. The Chicago Plan, put forth 70, 80 years ago or something, was that demand deposits at banks should be 100% reserved. They should be backed 100% by deposits with the central bank or something of equivalent instantly available value. Therefore, longer-term loans of banks would have to be financed by banks either borrowing from the public long-term, so they can't demand it back at an instant, or equity. Shareholders. This is Islamic banking, actually, is equity finance lending. Much more stable. It might be a little bit more expensive because banks don't get the free ride of huge maturity transformation between callable deposits and 10-year loans. But it would be vastly more stable and more secure. The bank runs wouldn't exist. There would be no, there would be no such thing as a bank run because the money is always 100% there. A CBDC, a central bank digital currency, has that feature, that the liability, money, the dollar, that in digital form is 100% backed by a claim on the central bank of equivalent value. So it is the Chicago Plan. So I'm much more sympathetic to the development of CBDCs, but of course the privacy aspects need to be given serious attention and protected. And there are other features of how one structures it that we would want to pay attention to. But I'm otherwise rather a fan.
Well, That is indeed an interesting development. There's in general a lot of overreaction to many fairly basic things. The BRICS and their financial, their financial run to compete with the dollar seems to be rather overrated at this current point in time. I think U.S. overspending is much more of an immediate concern.
I agree.
Whether that will pan out in the long term will, I think, also depend on whether the US can get its own policies in order and retain credibility as and its currency's credibility. But thank you so much for this fascinating insights. And in the video, once it's produced, I will direct the readers to your books and excellent. Yes, exactly. The latest one is my travels to Kosovo, which touches on some of the what we're seeing in some of the aftermath. I do wonder whether the current geopolitical tensions can once again disrupt the financial system and the financial order, or whether the European Union's presence will be able to prevent all of it from blowing up once again. But that too remains to be seen. Thank you very much for everyone watching this program, the Washington Outsider Report. We'll be back next Tuesday, 9 p.m. Thanks again, Dr. Coates, and have a good night.